Okay, council questions? Gloria.
Could I ask Joe or someone to respond to what Mr. Zuckerman said?
Yeah. This revision was proposed by the agency that probably has the greatest responsibility to restore habitats in the Delta. They're not suggesting a proposal that they think is going to be counterproductive. And we've talked this over with the Department of Fish and Game, who's primarily responsible for reviewing those actions, and they think it's a good idea. Now, we could leave this the way it has been for the last 6 months, and it might be a little more inconvenient for the Department of Water Resources, and Fish and Game thought that they were, this would be the logical way to try to accommodate concerns that there might be inaccuracies in the map. This puts no restriction on the use of private lands. It doesn't control, wildlife management activities on farms that are funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture because they're federally funded actions. And it's not intended to control those kind of uses. It really is aimed at habitat restoration actions.
The point of this is to see that the state's money or whoever's money spent towards restoration is done in the right way so that we don't waste their precious restoration dollars.
That's correct. Yeah.
So it's guidance, if nothing else, that it helps hone down where it ought to be. Yeah, I understand the umbrella issue that Tom is concerned about, but I think you've been pretty careful to not go there.
Yeah, and we, of course, in the subsequent policy that we'll be discussing in a minute, we try to constrain the areas that people might consider as high priority restoration areas so that we're not imposing restrictions needlessly on high value farmlands.
Okay, pleasure of the council.
Mr. Chair,
Don?
Yeah. I'd like to sleep on this one overnight and take a look and read this through again because I'm still not getting, real comfortable with this. Recognizing this language, we're basically integrating this by reference as an appendix for the Delta Plan, and just reading the language here as folks are speaking and kind of listening to what your explanation is. It still references 100,000 acres of habitat. Talks about, well, when sea level rise happens, this is what's going to happen, and I mean, it's language different than what we've worked through in the plan. Now, this is not our, our language. Again, we have obviously different charges under the Delta Plan, and I'm not saying this is inconsistent here, but I guess I'd like to, before I pass judgment, if the council wants to go ahead and say, I'm not hearing this. I'm uncomfortable right now.
Okay, let me just let's step back and look at the policy as initially proposed. It had said,
page 148 of the staff draft
plan, that habitat restoration must be carried out consistent with the elevation map attached as figure 4.3 and the text of Appendix H, which is based on the conservation strategy, that the Department of Fish and Game had prepared. And when habitats are proposed at alternative elevations, sufficient scientific rationale must be provided. We're simply trying to respond to a concern that we heard from the Department of Water Resources that there were challenges for them in relying on the map. And so what
relying exclusively on the areas identified.
So what they wanted to do was emphasize the text, which has always been guidance included within the appendix. It's been there as part of the plan and part of this policy since the fifth draft. And they wanted to just make it clear that the figure should be used as a guide, but that they didn't want to have it being the key thing that was referenced in the policy. So it's the subtlest of changes. It doesn't change the direction of the plan. It was something we were trying to do to accommodate an agency partner that had a concern about the details of the map.
Well, and Dan, I appreciate that. Maybe it highlighted for, at least for this member, then to going back to the text again, which we had a conversation some months ago about that, about the figure and about, some of the things that were behind that. But even this policy says, you reference the text, but it says with minor alterations. I don't know what that means, but.
Well, I think that was actually in a response to you who asked that people be able to make small changes to conform to what might happen. Remember, we had this discussion several months ago where you asked that boundaries and limits, that there be some flexibility in that.
That's what that
I think that's what that references.
Okay.
Tom's shaking his head.
Mr. Zuckerman.
I'm sorry, but I can't read this document and get the same meaning out of it that your staff is putting on it. It says habitat restoration must be carried out consistent with the elevation map. And now you've added something else that I haven't read. The very next one, ERP3, is the floating easement problem that I talked about.
Well, that's the next item on our agenda.
No, it isn't. It's not. The next one is your addition of some land on the western part of the delta.
But it is ERP3.
Okay, but this is doing two things wrong. It's limiting where people can carry out habitat projects, whether they're using state money, federal money, their own money, or something
It
else.
does not limit what people can do with their own money.
What does this mean? Habitat restoration.
It only applies to covered actions, which only apply to agencies.
Okay, but would it apply to the federal government?
No, because we don't have jurisdiction over federal agencies.
If you could give us some justification for controlling the federal agency legally, we might be enthusiastic about that.
Well, we get money, some people do, from the ag program through the state agencies. Is that considered to be a state deal, or is that considered to be a federal thing? State agencies are clearly subject to your jurisdiction.
Wait a minute. Supervisor Natoli's requested this item be delayed till tomorrow.
Okay, well,
I think we're going to honor that request from a member, but we're going to come back and we're going to take a vote on it tomorrow. By the way, the Appendix H, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Ray, this is text taken out of what we thought was a too long Delta scientific discussion by our Delta Science program in an earlier draft of the Delta Plan and made an appendix.
Yeah, it's
this
derived
language has been around for months and months. And I think Mr. Zuckerman is right. The title description of the source does not adequately explain that, although the fact it starts at page number 30 and goes on might be useful in an explanation. I don't know. So anyway, so we're going to put this one over at Don's request. Okay. Now, Don, do you want to do the same thing on the Dutch Slough proposal, which is the next item, File 8?
Well, I think maybe just an explanation. I mean, the staff, I read the comments that were submitted. In fact, they were, the agencies as to why they felt that area ought to be included. I guess from a staff perspective, though, it wasn't on the maps that we've circulated for a number of months now. It may be an area that's identified. But those Western Islands. Well,
let me give you some background. In the statute that created us, there was a section on early actions, and this is the legislature said a whole bunch of things like we appoint an independent science board, but then it goes on to say Department of Water Resources shall do a bunch of things, including assist in implementing early action ecosystem restoration projects, including but not limited to Dutch Slough tidal marsh restoration and Means Island tidal marsh restoration. Then Randy and I, remember, were a subcommittee to consider early actions, and we went through every suggestion made anywhere in the statute of something. And we discovered, of course, that nothing was fully permitted and ready to go. But this one seemed plausible and did not give rise to any of the arguments on other lands. So that's the background where we've had it. So we looked at it. You agreed at the time when we did the early action report that we could not, say yes, it should be done immediately because there were unanswered questions. But that's a second. That is different from the one you've just talked about.
And, if this policy about protecting opportunities to restore habitat, which prevents actions that would interfere with the opportunity to restore habitats in the Delta, has been part of the Delta Plan for a long time. It was put in out of concern that developments of various kinds could occupy the high priority areas that were high priorities for restoration, and so frustrate the accomplishment of the co-equal goal of protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta's ecosystem. At the request of local governments, and responding to their concerns that this was a policy that would blanket the entire Delta and interfere with many important activities, we worked to prepare maps that restricted the application of that policy to those highest priority restoration areas that seem to create the greatest benefit for the kinds of actions that the Delta Plan has recommended. There were 5 of those areas, and you've always had 5 areas that you identified in the narrative as high priority restoration. But in response to that, looking at those maps, the folks from the Department of Water Resources and the Department of Fish and Game said, hey, we've got restoration initiatives in these islands in the western delta we're also interested in. And why aren't those on the maps? And so when I inquired, it turned out the focus on 5 areas instead of the western islands as well. The 6th had a simple origin, and it was that someone had asked the science program as they were drafting this chapter to identify the 5 high priority areas. And so they gave you 5, and they never thought to say, you know what, there's a 6th one, and that includes Dutch Slough in these western islands. Dutch Slough was acquired by the CalFed program as a high priority ecosystem restoration area back in 2002, if I remember right. Decker Island, that's also would be identified here, is an area that's owned by the Department of Water Resources and has undergone extensive restoration action in the past. And the remaining island that would be identified is a former duck club that's out in the western delta and is at the appropriate elevations for restoration. So we're just trying to add those areas in so our people can have a clear understanding of where we think this policy would apply.
If I could, Mr. Chair, but the language also makes reference to Eastern Contra Costa and Sherman and Twitchell Islands, does it not? It doesn't show those won't be on the map, but it makes the wording.
In addition to those islands, the state is studying other restoration actions in the western delta, and what we're trying to do with this narrative is acknowledge that we're not identifying those as high priority areas now. We're not proposing that this policy ought to apply to them, but we are saying, there's a reason we don't necessarily need to apply the policy now, because it seems unlikely that they're going to be faced with significant interference in the near future. And should they be proposed for restoration, for example, in the BDCP or another restoration or conservation plan, the Delta Plan could be amended at that time to identify them.
So they're specifically not included.
Okay, and
in the regulation.
In the regulation, yes.
Are they referenced in the language?
Just to acknowledge that that there are other potential restoration areas that might be proposed as part of the BDCP or might be included in local NCCPs or HCPs, and that these could include portions of Sherman and Twitchell Island or other tracts. So people have talked about Sherman and Twitchell Island for a long time as being potential restoration areas. They're much too deeply subsided now to accommodate the kinds of restoration that are high priorities. Some people speculate that with disposal of spoils, for example, from a tunnel, they might be raised to an elevation that would make them suitable for restoration. But that's premature to speculate about that at this time, and we haven't had a chance to review the ideas behind these restoration projects. They haven't been able to go through the ISB, haven't been daylighted, so we're just trying to focus on those areas that are been well known for a long time and have minimal effects on the bulk of the delta.
All right, further questions on that? Pleasure of the council. Don?
Well, if we're going to put the other one over, again, we'll come back to tomorrow, but I appreciate the explanation. I'd like to maybe hold this with the other one, though.
You want to hold?
Yeah.
Okay. To Friday. Okay. All right, members, could you go to the last 2 pages of this? I want to just clear up if we can. On page number 4, item 15, limit state liability. This was an open item issue that somehow we didn't get around to discussing at our last meeting. And this is the notion, it grew out of a comment from Bob Pike in one of his letters that, you shouldn't do it that way. What you ought to do is get constitutional or statutory changes, and thus the suggestion from staff. Take a look at that if you would, please. Is there any